Hello, and as the cheery strains of the old Soviet national anthem fade away into the background, welcome back to the workshop, where the temperature today is appropriately rather Siberian, so I'll make this as quick as possible. At least it's not raining, so we'll not be interrupted by that. I said at the end of the last video that we'd be talking in this one about the most evil man in the world, and I'll qualify that slightly by saying is the person who I think was the most evil man in the whole of the 20th century, because there have been some fair shockers through history. Perhaps because they lived nearer our time, many in living memory, or perhaps because we have better documentation of their lives, the 20th century dictators seem to loom larger than even the very worst of the historical horrors, such as Genghis Khan or Caligula. They seem more like us, and that makes their behaviour appear even more heinous. Whether due to religious fanaticism, ideological zeal, tribalism, or simple megalomania, there were many men who managed to get themselves into positions of great power over their fellow citizens over the past century. The increasing reach of governments into ordinary lives meant that it became easier to climb greasy poles to gain positions of great power, and to maintain those positions with a tighter and tighter grip. In some cases, these men used existing political structures, in others they built new ones of their own, and in a few they simply destroyed all existing structures and ruled in apparent anarchy. The more successful ones worked their way up existing political structures in entirely legal ways, and then altered those structures so that no one could challenge them. Two men particularly played that horrible game better than anyone else ever did, and were able to exercise their enormous malevolent ambitions. And one of them did it better than anyone since Genghis Khan. So why Stalin, when most people would have chosen Adolf Hitler, probably? My reasoning is that Hitler kind of was doing it for the greater glory of Germany, but Stalin was doing it for the greater glory of Stalin, for pure power and really nothing else, and he didn't really care who got in his way. Yosef Yugashvili, he gave himself the name Stalin, which means man of steel, was a senior Bolshevik in 1917 and helped stage the October Revolution in St. Petersburg. In 1918, he was sent by Lenin to Volgograd, which was later called Stalingrad, to seize food for Moscow. He took with him the Ogpu secret police, the predecessor to the KGB. The most effective farmers were the small landowners, the kulaks, independent-minded people who worked their own lands and sold their surplus crops. There was general resistance to Stalin's efforts. The seizure of food, allied to poor distribution systems, led to large-scale famine starting in 1921. 16 million people were affected, and about 5 million died. After the end of the famine, the government largely withdrew from the countryside and let the kulaks return to their previous lifestyle. After this time, there was a rapid improvement in the quality of Soviet agriculture and an increase in the amount of meat and grain produced. The kulaks invested in new machinery and animals and prospered for several years. Stalin became head of the USSR in 1924 on Lenin's death. In 1929, he embarked on the first of his 5-year plans to modernise and industrialise the USSR. To do this, he needed large quantities of grain to sell abroad, so that machinery for the new factories could be purchased. The collectivization of Soviet farms began. The program wasn't any more popular this time than it had been before. There were nearly 2,000 revolts, and many kulaks burned their crops and farms and slaughtered their animals rather than let them fall into the hands of the government. Nearly 2 million kulaks were taken from the land and transported to Siberia in cattle trucks, where one of their first jobs was to build their own prisons in what became known as the Gulag Archipelago. Stalin's reaction to the new revolts, and his revenge for the ones a decade or so previously, was to teach the kulaks a lesson by manufacturing a new famine, which became known as the Holodomor. He sent 25,000 urban thugs into the agricultural areas to seize grain and animals, to destroy farms and machinery, and to displace the peasantry. These actions resulted in at least 5 million deaths, possibly up to 10 million. As well as this, about 8 million people fled the collective farms, denuding the agricultural areas of people who knew how to grow food. The result was inevitable. In 1930, Russia produced 84 million tonnes of grain. In 1934, 68 million. So I've now reached a stage where the farms are now collectivised, they all belong to the state, but there aren't enough people to work them. So the only other way to produce more food and thereby feed the people in industrial areas, which is where he was really interested in increasing production, was to make the land more productive. And to do this, he turned to his plant scientists, his biologists. And unfortunately, the man who'd managed to get himself in charge of that was a chap called Trofim Lysenko. Yeah, Lysenko had some rather strange ideas. Initially, he was a follower of Lamarckism, an ideology which rejected Darwinism as such, and instead it thought that inherited characteristics or acquired characteristics through life were passed on to succeeding generations rather than through genetic change. Lysenko didn't believe in genes, he didn't believe in DNA, so his appointment as head of genetics in Moscow was perhaps a bit strange. But that's where he was. He was head of genetics in Moscow, and he was therefore the most important plant biologist in Russia. His ideas were quite bizarre, and he seems to have believed mainly in a kind of a socialism of plants. He appears to have thought that they have some kind of will and will willingly pass on positive characteristics to other plants that happen to be nearby, and together they will collectively improve their own yields. Because of this, they insisted that the farmers did some very, very strange things, like planting the crops far too close together, which meant that the crops just failed. The result of this was, of course, a huge reduction in food output, and again there was famine across Russia. There was no point in arguing with Lysenko. If you did argue with Lysenko, you were out of a job, or you were exiled, or, as happened to many people, including the famous biologist Vavilov, you were sent to prison. And Vavilov died of starvation in prison 3 years after going there. There was simply no point in arguing with Lysenko. Even if you'd grown food on a particular piece of land for many years and you knew exactly how to get the best yield, Lysenko would overrule you. He had the ear of the boss, and that was it. And in the Soviet Union, you did not disagree with the boss. So there we have it. That's the lesson of extremely powerful politicians taking advice from one very particular favoured scientific source, which just happens to be very, very wrong and will not brook any dissent from that one particular point of view. Because of that, we've seen in the Soviet Union, 20 million people died. In China, another 30 million possibly. Lysenkoism was spread across most of the Soviet Union and devastated food production all across the USSR. Lysenko lived on for quite a while. After Khrushchev came to power, he was kind of sidelined a wee bit, but he lived on until about 1976 and died a rather forgotten man at that time, and that's probably the kindest thing that could have happened to him. We can only hope that the kind of influence that misguided scientists have with politicians who choose their advice from one very small number of sources is never repeated to that extent ever again.